Tanya portion for the 11th day of Adar, the Yud Aleph Adar, is at the beginning of Perek Lamed Gimel on page 82, or on the English page 148. Here the Rebbe goes back to the subject of simcha, of joy, that comes after the brokenheartedness. And previously the Rebbe had given two reasons, two motivations for the joy. One was that although the Nefesh HaBahamis, the animal soul, is in a bad state, but there is also a godly soul that deserves more attention. And secondly, even the animal soul is elevated and becomes refined through mitzvahs. Now the Rebbe says that there's a third consideration and a third motivation for a true joy. In Perek Lamed Gimel. Another thing which will bring a true joy, and especially when he sees within himself, at certain times, that he needs to purify the heart, and to illuminate the heart, or the nefesh, with a heartfelt joy, which means when he is experiencing Timtum Halev, and he needs this additional joy, azai. So in those times, yamik machshavte, he should think deeply, and he should imagine and picture in his understanding and in his mind, the truth about God's oneness. The Achdus Hashem, the oneness of God, exists on many levels. If he understands the true oneness of God, this will be a cause and a source of great joy. What is he supposed to think about? He's supposed to think how there is nothing besides God, and that is God's true oneness. It goes without saying that the Achdus Hashem, the oneness of God, means more than that there is only one God. It also means more than that nothing else in the world has a will of its own, or a power of its own, or an existence of its own besides God, or independent of God. What's more is that everything that exists really is Him, is God, and there is nothing besides Him. As Rebbe will explain. How God fills all the worlds, the higher worlds and the lower worlds, which means that the world is dependent on God because God gives it what needs to exist, makes it what it is. And this is the investment that God makes into the world of Himself that is tailored to each world specifically, that causes the existence of higher worlds and lower worlds. The more revelation is, the higher the world, the less the revelation, the lower the world. So that's one connection or one dependency of the world on God, of existence on God. And even this world is filled with God's glory, with God's kavod, which means that there's that investment that God makes, that level of relationship between God and creation that is equal in all worlds, and therefore even in this world, the lowest world, there is the same presence of God as in the higher world, because here we're talking about that part of God that surrounds the world and treats all worlds and all levels equally. And then there's an even higher level of oneness, and then there's a level in which all existence is as if it doesn't exist, and therefore God is alone, not only the source of all existence, or the master of all existence, but that He is alone, both in the higher worlds and in the lower worlds equally. How alone is He? Just as God was alone before the 6 days of creation, and at that time it wasn't enough. It wouldn't have been correct to say that God is the master of all the worlds. There were no worlds. It wouldn't have been enough to say that none of the worlds can exist without him. There weren't any worlds. There was only him. And exactly the same way, now, after creation, God is not only the master or the controller or the origin of the world, but there is nothing besides him. V'gam b'mokim hazeh, shenivra b'olam hazeh. And even in this place, or in this level, in this space, into which the world was eventually created, hashamayim v'ha'aretz v'chol tzevom, the heaven and the earth, and all that is in them, so even that level into which a physical world came into existence, hoyahu levade, memala hamokim hazeh, so before the 6 days of creation, this space that eventually became a physical world was filled exclusively with God alone, and there was nothing else. Gam atokein hu, and the same is true now as well, that there is nothing besides God. Hu levade b'li shum shini klal. He is alone without any change at all. There's been no change in his aloneness. He is as alone now, after creation, as he was before creation. Now the Rebbe will explain how this is so by using two examples. One from the nefesh and speech as it exists within the soul, and the other from light as it exists within the sun. Basically, the point of the mashal is that when something exists only as a property and as an ingredient in something else, then only that original creation, only that original thing really exists, and the other has no existence, has no identity of its own. It is only a property of the thing in which it exists. So, for example, if we want to talk about potentialities, so we could speak of a child, of a child in the womb, of a fetus, and we can speak of it in two ways. We're either discussing the fetus itself, and then we would say this is a potential human being, or when we talk about a person who's already born, we can say that if we trace back the beginnings of this person's existence, we will find that he once existed in a potential state, and at that time he was a fetus. But that was the potential for the human being that will eventually be born. So that even before the person is born, he already has some existence because he exists in a state of potential. He was a fetus, he was an embryo. Another way of looking at it is that we're talking about a human being, and we're saying that each human being, every human being, has the potential to create a child. When we say that a person has the potential to create a child, there is no child yet. No child exists at all. Why then are we speaking of a child? Because one of the properties and one of the talents that make up the human being who does exist is that he has within himself the potential to create a child. But that potential is not the beginning of the child's existence. This is the completion of the father's existence. This is what makes the man or the woman a full-fledged human being, in that they have the capacity to reproduce. So on the one hand, we speak of a child, of the potential of a child, but this is not the same as saying the child exists in potential. The child doesn't exist yet at all. There is nothing besides the man or the woman who have the potential to become a mother or father. There's a potential within the adult, within the human being, to have a child, but no child exists here yet at all. The talk of child, when we speak about the child, it's only as an ingredient in the father and mother. So that everything, while it is in its origin, means that it exists as a part of the origin, not as a being unto itself at all. So that when God creates the world, and we say that there is a creation, we speak of a world that is existing, and at the same time we say that it's non-existent at all within its source. Because the world never leaves God, because God is everywhere, So it never goes away from its origin, and as long as something is in its origin, it means that its existence consists of the fact that this is one of the ingredients and properties of the origin. But no second existence, no second being has come into play at all. Now we'll look at the examples. The first example is with the speech in the soul, because in fact God created the world through speech, so it is the closest marshal that we can find for creation. 4 lines from the top. Why is it that God is as alone after creation as before? Mipnei shekol hanivroyim, because all that was created is betelim etzle b'metzias mamish, are completely no existence at all within God. Kibitul eisius hadibur v'hamachshava b'mekedam v'sharsham, just as the letters and the images of speech and thought with which we speak and think are non-existent within their source. Hu muhus hanefesh v'atzmusa, the source of the letters of speech and thought are the essence of the nefesh, and the essence of the nefesh is shehein eser b'chinei seha. The 10 powers of the soul are the soul's essence, and those are chachma, bina, das, etc. So when a person is understanding, is comprehending something, and hasn't yet thought about it, hasn't yet spoken of it, she'ein bohem b'chinas eisius adayin, their letters don't exist yet. There are no images with which to communicate yet. He has only the concept itself, kedim shemislapshes b'levush hamachshava, before the knowledge has clothed itself even in the garment of thought. He hasn't even had a chance to think about it himself. He has just discovered an idea. So he now knows something. But the letters with which to communicate that haven't come into existence yet. Although we know that they must exist there, in the concept itself there must be letters and words and images with which to convey that concept. But those letters haven't taken on an existence yet at all. They are still within the concept itself. And therefore they're completely bottled there. And as we find also, we write also in another place, a more physical example for this, that even a more physical thing can be completely bottled within its mokkeh. And that is me'inyan bittul zive'er hashemesh b'mekeirei, the bittul, the non-existence of the sun's rays and the sun's light, while it is within its source, hu guf kader hashemesh b'rakia, which is the body of the sun itself. So here we find the same thing. Shegam shom meir u'mispashet vadai zivei ve'evei, because there too, in the body of the sun itself, there is no doubt that the rays of the sun and the light of the sun exist there. U'biyeses eis, and even more strongly, more intensely, mehispashtuse v'haraose b'chol ha'elam, than the way that the rays of the sun exist when they spread out and illuminate space. So the light of the sun exists within the sun even more intensely than the way it exists outside the sun when it's illuminating space. Elo shesham hu bottled b'metzius b'mekeirei, only there in the body of the sun, the rays of the sun are non-existent because they're completely absorbed in their source, which means that they are an element and an ingredient and a property of the source, and therefore are no existence of their own at all. And therefore it's as if they don't exist at all, because their existence is the sun, not the state of light or of rays. In exactly the same way, by analogy, who bittul ha'elam u'malayai is the bittul and the non-existence of the world and everything that is in it. B'metzius, in its very existence it is bottle. It is not only humble, but it is bottle in its very existence. Legabi mekayvei, in its relationship to its source. Shehu Eid Ein Sof Baruch Hu, which is the divine light, so because creation is always within its source, meaning to say that it exists only as a property, as an expression of the Creator, therefore the only thing that exists, in fact, is the Creator. Creation itself has no existence. Now when a person will think on this at length, Yismach libei, his heart will rejoice. Betogil nafshe, and his soul will be joyful. Af gilas v'ranon, with a joyfulness and a singing of the soul. B'chol lev v'nefesh u'ma'id, with his whole heart, soul, and might. Be'emunazu, in this faith. This experience of the oneness of God, this insight into the oneness of God, is referred to here as emunah, not as a seichel thing, not as something that we comprehend logically, but as an element of faith, of emunah, because it originates in emunah, and only afterwards can it be understood in seichel as well. Ki rabohi, because this faith is great, it is intense. Ki hi kirvas elikim mamash, because it represents an actual closeness to God, which means that this exclusivity, recognition of the fact that only God exists and there's nothing else, this is a great closeness to God, because in the exclusion of all other things, when we have no other attachments, when we have no other loyalties, because nothing else exists, then all our loyalty and all our attachment and our entire focus is on God Himself, and that makes God very close. So there's a monogamous relationship here, an exclusive relationship that brings an intense closeness and intimacy between God and the world. So that's from God's part, from God's side, that He is everything and there's nothing besides Him. And this is also the essence and the substance of man, of the human being. It is the ultimate purpose for his being created. And also the ultimate purpose for the creation of all worlds, the higher worlds as well as the lower worlds, that God should have this dwelling place in the lower world, as we will explain later at length. So, being that this is the ultimate purpose for man's existence, and this is the whole substance of man, therefore it follows that he must be capable of doing this, that he has the ability to see beyond the surface and recognize that the world that appears to exist as a separate being, as a creation, is really an element of Creator, and there's nothing besides God. Now, how great will this joy be? We can imagine by comparing it to the joy that a person will feel if he were close to a physical king. How great is the joy of a common person, and a lowly person, if he were to get close and intimate with a king who is physical. How does this closeness come about? Hamisachsein, who is a guest in the simple man's, in the lowly man's house, a guest, but more than a guest. V'dor ite imei, not only does he come as a temporary guest, but he lives with him together with the simple lowly man. Bebeisei, and not that the simple man is together with the king in the king's house, but that the king comes and lives with him in his house, which is where the simple man feels more comfortable, and yet even there on that comfort level, where he is comfortable, the king lives with him and is present at all times. So we can imagine how great that joy would be, how intense that connection would be. So it's so much more so infinitely more so. That there is an even greater joy when we experience a closeness and an indwelling of the King of Kings, of God, when He dwells in this world with us. What does it mean that He dwells with us? When we recognize, when the world recognizes that there is nothing besides Him, when we experience a total exclusive devotion to Him alone, then this world becomes His dwelling place. It becomes a place where He can be Himself completely. And as it says, the Pasuk says, who could dare to approach to me, God says, which means that no creation, no creature has the ability to get close to God except for the Jew who has this emunah in the exclusive oneness of God. So that from both directions, it is only the Jew who is given this emunah, and therefore for God there is a monogamous relationship, so to speak, that God singles us out to the exclusion of everybody else in this emunah, and we single out God to the exclusion of everything else, that ein neid milvadei, there's nothing besides Him. And this Achdus Hashem, this connection to God, is Adar b'tachtenim. This is when the world becomes for God His main dwelling place, and this is the cause of the ultimate greatest simcha, because the other forms and the other reasons for simcha were temporary, were limited. First of all, the simcha was only in the nefesh, because the godly soul, at the time that he does mitzvahs, experiences a release from the confinement of the body, and that release is a cause for joy, but that's only for the nefesh, for the neshama. And even when the animal soul is elevated, and it too becomes refined and so on, which is another reason for joy, but again the joy is only in the nefesh, only in this case the nefesh abahamis. And secondly, this comes only when the person is doing mitzvahs. When he's involved in doing mitzvahs, when the world is busy doing mitzvahs, then there's a holiness in the world, and then there's a recognition of godliness. But when the person is not doing mitzvahs, then we lose that connection. But here, in the recognition of the oneness of God, that ein neid milvadei, this is a constant state. It is true of the world itself, not of how we think of God or what we're feeling about God. The world itself, whether we feel it or see it or not, is completely bottled. So when we experience that, that is the true and permanent joy. And as the Rebbe will explain later, what the expression of that joy is, but we'll learn that tomorrow. In the Hayom Yom for Yud Aleph Adar Sheni, and in that year in Tafshin Gimel, Tainus Esther was also a Mugdam. It was also on Thursday. So the Rebbe writes that Chassidus contains two important principles. Number one, to understand every halacha the way it is understood in its source and in its origin, in the spiritual, which means how the mitzvah, how the halacha exists in the spheres and in the levels of each world according to its properties, as is explained in Chassidus. The second thing is understanding every halacha in Aveda, which means to bring it down, that even though the chachma and the seichel of the halacha is a divine seichel, and it's a din in Torah, at the same time, we have to find within every halacha an aveda, a practical instruction in the behavior of man in his daily life. So we have to understand the halacha both in its highest origin as well as bringing it down into its most practical application.